Welcome, everybody, to Nerding Out with Nic Bodiford. I am your host, Nic Bodiford. The date is July 12th, and I am joined by Dr. Adam Hutchison of 4 for 4. How are you doing, Adam?
Good, man. Appreciate you having me here.
Yeah, I've really been enjoying your work this offseason, and that's what we have you here to talk about. We're going to go round by round using Underdog ADP, current ADP, and just talk about one guy who may or may not have injury related concerns. Some are in the past, some the issues that guys are currently dealing with. Kicking things off, and I'm probably most excited about this one just because we've had a number of back and forths about him, and Adam has a phenomenal piece out on him that you all should go read. But first guy going with an average ADP of pick number 2 as the RB2, Christian McCaffrey of the Carolina Panthers. So here, I'm going to read off his list of injuries real quick that he's had since 2020. Okay, here's what we're dealing with. September 20, actually, we don't need the date, just injury list. High ankle sprain, shoulder AC joint sprain, thigh/glute strain, thigh/hamstring strain, and pedal ankle sprain grade 2. That's over the last 2 years. 3 of those were 2020, last 2 were 2021. So take it away, Adam. Should we be concerned about McCaffrey?
So, in short, like you were talking about that one piece, I basically lay out all those injuries and talk about how, to an extent, I don't think a lot of them are related. I think you could make an argument with some of those soft tissue injuries that Christian McCaffrey was having were related to him potentially bulking up in preparation for a heavier workload in Carolina. And it's speculation on my part, certainly. I mean, I'm not working out with Christian McCaffrey or know personally the people that are training with Christian McCaffrey, but when you start to add some of that muscle mass and build up, you sacrifice some mobility for stability. And as a result, I think with the lack of mobility that he potentially caused for himself, could have had some of those soft tissue injuries. You know, the shoulder and ankle sprains, those are super common injuries for running backs. And what's interesting, it's an outlier. We can't really count on it. You know, when I look at high ankle sprain data for running backs, it significantly hampers them when they come back from a high ankle sprain. You see a steep decline in fantasy production specifically. And we only got one game of it in 2020 because Christian McCaffrey then hurt his shoulder and missed an extended period of time. But when Christian McCaffrey came back from that high ankle sprain in 2020, he was amazing. He was performing well above his previous fantasy averages. So I think that just speaks to the type of athlete that he is, the type of player that he is. And then going a little bit further in regarding to some of that piece that you were talking about, just looking at peak age of fantasy production amongst the running back position. And there's a lot of statistical jargon in there, but essentially it comes out to, I think players that profile like Christian McCaffrey that are heavily involved in the passing game, heavily involved in the rushing game, and extremely efficient at both of those, age a little bit more gracefully and have some type of fantasy level. So, you know, that 2019 performance that Christian McCaffrey had, that was unworldly. I think those days are probably behind him, but because he's such a good receiver and involved in the passing game a lot, I think he certainly has fantasy value and is justifiable to take in the first round.
What I recall about the 2019 season, and I think Dr. Edwin Porras pointed it out, it wasn't just that his touch rate was really high, it was that his snap rate was really high. It was like 99%, which is significantly higher than other lead backs. Usually guys at least get a breather and they don't have to go out there and cut and stuff when they're not touching the ball. So I think that should lower his injury risk. To your point about maybe those days being over, do you think do they need to significantly scale back his touches, or is it just like taking off a few carries but keeping the receiving profile intact?
I mean, there's been a lot about talk about, like, you know, tread on the tires and when is too many carries for a running back. And there's been some research looked into it. I'm still looking into it myself in terms of finding definitive numbers, some hard data that supports one claim or the other. to me, it's not a novel concept. It's pretty intuitive that if you're getting more carries, if you're getting more snaps in a game like football, that's a physical sport, you're exposing yourself to higher injury risk. So I think Carolina probably realized that to a certain extent by adding Chuba Hubbard and adding Devonta Foreman, but I don't think the touches those guys are going to get are going to necessarily hurt you as a fantasy manager if you have Christian McCaffrey. I don't think they're going to be involved in the passing work. They could see some red zone touches, but I think those are your prototypical grinder between the 20s backs that maybe are getting some carries that don't really matter. And when Carolina's moving the ball, when Carolina is passing specifically, I think Christian McCaffrey is going to be what he's doing. And he's such an efficient runner that I don't think he needs to see that high volume of touches. If they take away 5 or 6 carries a game, and you can guarantee that Christian McCaffrey is going to be available all season, I think as a fantasy manager, you'd be happy with that.
Yeah. Okay. We're in agreement here. Actually, I have him as my my number 1 overall player. I pushed him up above Jonathan Taylor this week. I think the touch count's going to be awfully similar, and he's just going to get so many more looks in the passing game than JT. The only other thing I wanted to touch on here was just the age work that you did in this article is excellent. And as you categorized him, the all-purpose plus backs, those guys typically can go till like 27 and a half, and he's only entering his age 26 season. So I think, for dynasty purposes, I think we still even have like 2 years left of him being a beast.
Yeah.
It was
I was talking to someone. I appreciate that, and I'm glad you enjoyed it. It's just something that, as I look at these injuries, it's something that interests me, and I think it plays a factor. And I was talking to somebody on Twitter about this, and they were kind of disagreeing in terms of what those hard cutoffs are. And I can agree. The whole point of that is, certainly when you're filtering out those running backs and creating these buckets, you're creating, an elite bucket and then kind of a good bucket and like a bad running back bucket when you're filtering those guys out and looking at different age apexes. But that was kind of the whole study is like, let's take all these elite guys that are really good pass catchers and really good runners and then siphon them out and say, okay, these are the elite of the elite. It's not a super confounding find to say like, oh, these guys age a little bit gracefully. But I think in dynasty purposes, when we're llooking at those guys, people are looking and going, oh, Christian McCaffrey, he's pretty old. He's kind of getting up there. And it's like, well, you still, I think, have a small window. It's a small window, but I think there's still a little bit of window that says, well, actually these guys age a little bit more gracefully because if I had to guess, they're so involved in the passing game. They're such good receivers that these NFL offenses can say, no, we can still use these guys in certain ways.
Yeah. The age stuff gets thrown around so often and so incorrectly. It used to be thought of that like age 30 was the wall for running backs. And I don't know how we ever arrived at that conclusion because it's a lot earlier than that. Anyway, we should move. We got a long list, so we should probably
is there anything we got a lot of guys.
Okay. Yeah.
No, you're good.
So round 2, the player for round 2 is Deebo Samuel, who I just personally was have been very high on the guy through the first 2 years of his career, and finally, because I didn't do my injury homework, just checked out of him in the 3rd year, and that was a bummer because I let him go in a high stakes league. But so here's the list. He obviously Deebo balled out last year, but he still did get banged up. So I'm gonna hit the injuries that he suffered since 2019. 2019, he had an inguinal groin strain, which we've seen a number of guys get knocked out for a long time with those. I think he only played, or no, he played the majority of the season that year, but he was just out he went on IR. Came back in 2020. Suffered so in June suffered a Jones fracture, then a hamstring strain, another hamstring strain. Enter 2021, thigh glute strain, leg calf strain, leg shin bruise, which is probably ignorable, another inguinal groin strain in November, and then some sort of knee strain in the playoffs in January. Where are you? What are your thoughts on Deebo entering 2022?
Yeah, I mean, I have high hopes. I think For me, it's really tough with Deebo, and this is an extremely small sample. But when we look at these wide receivers that have that factor for greater than 10% of their team's rushing attempts, in addition to their involvement in the passing work, we get a very small sample of players that have actually like filled out that Deebo role. Looking back, I think all the way to 2017 is probably as far back as I looked. Yeah, 2017. We got a small sample of these wide receivers, and it includes Tavon Austin, Cordell Patterson, Curtis Samuel. Okay, those are guys that at least for one season have done it, and Deebo Samuel falls into that same bucket. Outside of Cordell Patterson, who I think is just an anomaly, and if you look at Cordell Patterson's build, he probably has more of a similar build to Deebo Samuel than those other guys. But those two other guys, the following season, Tavon Austin missed 9 games with a groin core injury. Curtis Samuel missed 12 games with a core injury. That's what we saw last year from Curtis Samuel. I think when you're exposing these wide receivers to some of this running back workload, you're asking for some type of extensive workload injuries. The other one that is an example on that, and this is going back to college, is Laviska Shenault in Colorado had a very similar core injury, doing what he did for Colorado. And that's another guy that's similar to Deebo's build. Again, small sample. We're talking about 4 wide receivers. You can't really draw any correlation from that. There's no point in doing any type of, linear regression or logistic regression, just looking at a small sample like that. But I think it says, hey, if you're exposing these guys to a running back workload, you're going to expose them to some type of running back contact. I think that probably factored into why Deebo wanted to get paid this offseason. He probably was looking at the 49ers and like, hey, man, I'm doing everything. You're asking me to, expose myself to some injury. If I'm going to be taking these running back carries, I need to be taken care of and paid. So I think one or two things are potentially going to happen. You're going to see a reduction in that running back workload, which I think was probably some of the main issues that Deebo and the 49ers were having this offseason, which I don't think is bad for his longevity, but I think certainly hurts his fantasy production, because that top end fantasy production, he had like 7 or 8 rushing touchdowns last year. That was a huge part of his fantasy output. I think if you've seen that, even cut into a quarter, that ceiling comes down a little bit, but you've seen him in the open field and down the field. He's a very explosive wide receiver. I still think he's a very good fantasy asset as a wide receiver, but that ceiling that we saw last year, I think is either unsustainable in terms of a workload concern, or just isn't there. The reason the 49ers probably added some running back depth this offseason is they know that they can't ask Deebo Samuel to do that again.
So that's fascinating. I did not know that. The way that you profile all those guys and found the inguinal groin strain, and even down to Shenault in college, that's fantastic work. And you nailed the 8 touchdowns rushing that Deebo scored. So the interesting thing with him, and I didn't give him enough credit in terms of his production last year, just as a receiver, when I started getting ready for, doing my homework on this season, he caught 77 of 121 targets for 1,405 yards and 6 touchdowns. So if we do take, actually, I should do the math on that. If we take away the rushing work, down to like 20 carries or something instead of 59, I bet he's still a wide receiver 1, probably more in the back end. But
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where I view him, kind of like I agree with what you're saying. That's where I would have him. I just think there's some people, and it's not so much, I don't see it so much on Twitter and in the fantasy community, because I think people are pretty sharp and they realize that is not realistic. But it's easy to look back at Deebo Samuel last year and say, holy cow, this guy finished as, in the top 3 amongst wide receivers. When you dig a little bit deeper for maybe some of your casual fantasy players, it's like that it's fueled by that rushing production. I think that hurts the ceiling, but it doesn't necessarily say I'm avoiding Deebo. I think Deebo is a great fantasy option. I think he's a great wide receiver. I think the way he got there was very different than Cooper Kupp, very different than Devontae Adams, very different than Justin Jefferson. And unless he can, somehow figure out to do the Cordell Patterson kind of workload thing, I don't know that you see the rushing production there to elevate him.
So if they do take off like 60 to 70% of the rushing work, are you concerned about the soft tissue stuff, the calf strains and hamstring strains? Are you concerned about that continuing, or if they take away the rushing work, might he be a little bit less volatile in that regard?
I think anytime you start to see some of those soft tissue things emerge, and if people that played dynasty football or in Devy leagues know that Deebo Samuel had kind of a questionable injury history coming out of college, which is part of the reason he kind of slipped into the second round of the NFL draft when he was coming out. I mean, it's not great. I think it's early enough in his career where you could maybe give him the benefit of the doubt and say, was it maybe some of that rookie cliff workload management? The Jones fractures is a fluke thing. It's a tough break. But when he came back from the Jones fracture, he was actually like super efficient, even surpassed my expectations for him coming off that injury right away. So I guess kind of a roundabout answer to say is like, there would have to be a little bit more of a soft tissue injury history for me to be a little bit concerned. Someone like a Julio Jones injury history where you can start to see him kind of stack up in terms of soft tissue injuries. For Deebo, he's just not there yet. This year I think is a pivotal year, but it's not enough for me to fade him.
Okay. All right. Moving on to our next guy. We have Travis Etienne of the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's coming off the board at the very end of the third round, 35.7 as the RB16. Etienne suffered Liz Frank injury, so foot injury at the beginning of last season. I don't think he even played regular season snaps. It was right before the opening week kickoff, or sometime in August rather. The only thing that I know about these injuries is again from Edwin, and that players in their first year back tend to see a 21% dip in production. But it seems to me that the time of year that he hurt himself might play a factor in terms of what our expectations are for him. Like this could have occurred a couple months later on. So yeah, take it away. Can we draft Etienne here in the third round? I'm a little bit nervous, but I want to draft him.
Yeah, I think the third round is I'm super high on Etienne, and even the third round is probably a little bit rich for me. I'd be more comfortable with him in the middle to late fourth round. I think he's an absolute smash at that spot. If you're fading him there because of injury history, I don't know. I mean, the Liz Frank is tough. It's a tough injury for running backs historically. It's been a killer for running backs. I think you nailed it in terms of him when he had the injury. He did not play all last year. He's already paid the price. I think if you're pushing Etienne out of the fourth round into the fifth or sixth round because of this injury, you're almost double counting him for it. He already missed the season. Edwin is really on top of his analytical stuff, and he talked about that 21% decline that you see after a Liz Frank injury. The problem is Etienne didn't play last year, so you don't know where his ceiling is. If this is unrealistic, but if I told you, Travis Etienne's ceiling is 350 fantasy points, PPR fantasy points, but he's going to have a 21% reduction of that, you'd be like, I'm all over that anyways. I'm getting more than 300 points from my running back. Sure, that's awesome. Again, very, very small sample, but looking very recently at Liz Frank injuries, the two examples I've got are Marquis Hollywood Brown and Evan Ingram. Versus their career averages, they saw about a 15% decrease in production. This is against career averages, not prior before, because Hollywood Brown's was in his rookie year. So there's no data to bounce that off of beforehand. So it's a little bit less something, I think, just kind of softens the blow a little bit. In terms of games played, they were right at their career average. Looking at targets, Marquise Brown versus career average, 12% decrease in target. Evan Ingram versus your career average, 40% uptick. I think it's probably because Evan Ingram was a veteran at that time. So looking at some of just the receiving yards, obviously, because these guys are tight end and running back. I'm tight end, wide receiver, not running back. The numbers weren't too bad. Again, like I said, full transparency. It's a small sample, but my point on Travis Etienne was, I don't think there's a lot of recent research that's going into these Liz Frank injuries because it's such a weird injury. He missed the entire season. For me, one of the biggest things is what Jacksonville did, him coming off that season. So James Robinson tore his Achilles. I am not optimistic about James Robinson coming back at all. I know people love the Cam Akers comparison, but that was super fast. Cam Akers was a shell of himself. I think that James Robinson is going to struggle in this season. So Jacksonville has to know that. And Jacksonville's looking at a running back that didn't play at all last year and James Robinson coming off an Achilles tear. And what do? They draft a running back in the 5th round. And I know people are kind of excited about Snoop Connor. He could be really interesting. But if you have concerns, you're not drafting you're not investing in somebody in just the 5th round to add a little bit of depth. I think Jacksonville is confident in this guy. Similar to Christian McCaffrey, he has that receiving profile. We haven't seen it at the NFL level yet, but he profiles, when we look at his college tape and his involvement with Trevor Lawrence at Clemson, he profiles as that receiving running back. I think he's somebody, that RB dead zone that people like to talk about this year, the 4th or 5th round, he is in there, and he is certainly somebody I think you could argue has one of the higher ceilings in that group.
You're talking about Akers?
Talking about Etienne.
Okay. Yeah. So I do. So to your point about rookie Snoop Connor, yeah, I have a tough time getting on board with this. We do know that like athleticism matters. So as a 5th round pick, and athleticism does kind of matter at running back, and like it is some of these drills are more closer to an offensive lineman than they are running back. So I agree. It does seem as though the team is confident in Travis Etienne, and your point about bringing in James Robinson. So this blends nicely into the next guy that we're going to talk about here, Cam Akers, coming off the board in the 4th round. Can you compare these two Achilles tears and break down what you expect out of Cam Akers this year? Because I am all the way out on Akers, and I feel like I'm on an island with that take.
Yeah, I his value certainly took a big swing from the end of the Super Bowl to where we are now in terms of fantasy drafts. I think people were really enamored with Cam Akers because he came back from that Achilles tear so quickly, which is really a testament to, his athleticism as a player. I think there's reason to be optimistic. I have a decent amount of Cam Akers, because I think similar to Etienne, he's kind of had that off season to recuperate and come back. Him coming back in under 5 months, in under 6 months was impressive. He looked like a guy to me that wasn't necessarily in football shape, wasn't ready as a running back, and struggled, and we saw that in some of his efficiency metrics. So he's in that dead zone too, and I'm okay. I've kind of found myself in some best ball drafts, and doing the Scott Fishbowl right now that's going on. I'm okay in those rounds 4 to 6. I think you can grab a couple of guys, and if you're lucky, you're going to hit it out of the ballpark. If not, you can kind of piece some other things together and hopefully just get one viable running back out of there that can carry you. I think Cam Akers is in that same boat.
But this injury, the way in which he ruptured the Achilles, is it different than what happened to James Robinson?
No, it's a full tear. It's a full tear. The only difference might be the location, and that might get a little more medical and technical than we need to. If it's a full tear, you have to repair it. There's been some advancements in terms of the medical procedures that they're doing, which is, I think, helping and expediting some of these rehabs and these recoveries. But if it's a tear, it's a full tear.
Okay. So your assumption or your analysis is that Akers is going to be able to get back to a physical state where he can be a productive lead back. Like, do you expect they're going to have to spell him and feature Darrell Henderson, or is it just, can Cam Akers be healthy enough to carry a full starting running back workload?
Yeah. I think that's harder to project. I know a lot of people like Darrell Henderson this year, and I think he's he's interesting, but Darrell Henderson himself hasn't really been the epitome of health. I mean, he struggled as well. I think what some of the research has shown us for some of these more devastating injuries like an Achilles or an ACL tear. Players that are drafted higher are typically better athletes. The teams certainly have more invested in them. They're more likely to go back to him. Cam Akers falls in that boat. I think Cam Akers was like a second or third round pick. I want to say it was a second round pick by the Rams. I mean, they've got something invested in Cam Akers that I think he's going to get every opportunity to kind of come back and either, be the lead back or see the majority of the carries if the Rams want to go a little bit of committee with Darrell Henderson. But I think that's baked into Cam Akers ADP. I think if you knew Cam Akers was going to get a Najee Harris or, trying to think of, a Leonard Fournette, assuming he kind of holds off Rashad White for a little bit. But if they were going to get those type of workloads, he'd be a second round pick, right?
Yeah. Okay. All right. Good stuff. Moving on to round number 5, we have Rashad Bateman, and if there's time, maybe JK Dobbins, but Bateman, I mean, expectations for him were sky high last year. He was kind of going to just come in, play the X receiver role in Baltimore, get Marquis Brown kind of more in the position that he's meant to play. And then he suffered an inguinal groin strain in August, and then did he re-injure it November later that year?
I don't have anything specifically about re-injury. He could have, and I missed that a little bit. The injury that he had, kind of that groin core sports hernia type, the anatomy of it is what makes it a little bit confusing, but they kind of all mesh together in a similar way. I think that's just a tough injury to come back from, especially for a rookie. I'm kind of giving Rashod Bateman a pass in terms of what we saw in 2021. I don't think he was ever really healthy. And then when he was, when he came back, he was kind of behind the 8 ball, and it's difficult to recover from that. I mean, similar injuries to what you saw in like Deshaun Jackson in 2020, where it totally derailed him. Curtis Samuel last year, I mean, had a tough time recovering from that and had surgery as well. And then he came back and re-aggravated it, and they shut him down. I think you got to give Rashod Bateman a pass. And I think, there's, especially with Marquis Brown gone, there's reason to be really excited about him in 2022.
Yeah. A lot of targets to be had there. Okay. I like that. I'm happy to hear that. He's a guy I want to root for and a guy who I want to draft. Moving on into the 6th round, we have running back Elijah Mitchell of the San Francisco 49ers. So Mitchell, I get a little bit undersized, 5'10", 200 pounds. I think ideally he'd be a little over like 210, but part of the, size kind of makes his game. He's very quick. Injuries that he suffered last year in 2021, some sort of shoulder injury, it's not specified, chest, rib sprain / pull, unspecified, thanks Kyle Shanahan, finger fracture, concussion, and patella sprain, right? Or I guess that it was categorized as knee irritation, and I've got it here, patella sprain. I mean, patella injuries freak me out, but I love Elijah Mitchell. So what is it? How should we be looking at him in 2022?
It's part of the reason why, especially in dynasty leagues, people are pretty wary of these late round picks, because even if they do flash, it doesn't take much of an injury to take them off the field, and they lose their starting role to somebody else. What I've got marked down for him last year in terms of the NFL, a concussion, finger fracture, and an AC joint sprain. We talked about Christian McCaffrey. AC joint sprain, super common for running backs. It's an unfortunate part of the game, especially when guys are coming out of the hole or getting tackled from behind. Those AC joint sprains are a common mechanism of injury. Finger fracture, it's like, what are you going to do? That's football. And then a concussion, like who hasn't had a concussion at some point in the NFL? I honestly think the injury history isn't concerning about Elijah Mitchell. It's the fact that we've seen San Francisco invest in a running back in the draft with Tyrion Davis-Price out of LSU. again, something that I've been super interested in looking into and just haven't had time. And I know this isn't super helpful right now as we're talking about, is just looking at specific run schemes and how they affect running backs, injury rate or whatnot. Kyle Shanahan's zone running scheme, for whatever reason, has kind of been labeled notoriously as a one that leaves running backs at high risk of injury, which is probably why they invest in running backs a lot. You know, we talk about Jeff Wilson Jr., Raheem Mostert, those guys over the years. So I think Elijah Mitchell, if anything else, he showed you that he could do it. I certainly think at the right price in ADP, he's worth a flyer because he can produce and the San Francisco offense, again, charts out favorably. But yeah, there's risk with just losing touches. And unfortunately, if he does have an injury, you wonder if someone runs away with that job when he's out.
Yeah, I had never really taken the idea that draft capital was some sort of really big pusher. Like, if the guy can play, the guy can play. But I mean, San Francisco might be one exception. Canning, Dante Pettis, Trey Sermon, like they do seem to kind of just kill their darling, so to speak. But this is good, and I will keep an eye out for any potential work that you do on running scheme injuries. That would be fascinating. Moving on to our next guy, Michael Thomas, wide receiver, New Orleans Saints. Losing track here. That's round 7. So we know that he suffered his high ankle sprain in 2020. Before that, he had a foot sprain, a high ankle sprain in 2020, hamstring pull, and then another foot sprain or pedal ankle sprain in December of 2020. And that thing has just been haunting him ever since. We're seeing videos of him like doing box jumps and not looking 100% running routes recently. Do you have any idea what's going on with Michael Thomas, and can we draft him?
Yeah, I think it's tough. Some of those videos, it's hard to know when they were made. A friend of mine that I respect, that's also a physical therapist, Jeff Mueller at JMTHRIVEPT on Twitter. I just wanted to give him a shout out because he kind of pointed this out, that you don't know where those videos are coming from, Michael Thomas. They could be from 4 months ago and we're just seeing them now for whatever reason. But Michael Thomas is, I've been pretty optimistic about a lot of these players. Michael Thomas is probably one that I'm pretty pessimistic about. I'm worried about it. We haven't seen him play in a while. I don't like ankle foot injuries for older wide receivers. I think that can certainly start to be a downward trend. Some recent examples I can think of, AJ Green a couple years ago, Julio Jones had a couple of those foot injuries early on in his career. They're just tough, and especially for someone like Michael Thomas that is so well known as a crisp route runner. I think you worry about that a little bit. And then again, major speculation on my part. How that injury was handled last year, specifically by Michael Thomas in his camp, I think was less than ideal. It came out that New Orleans said you needed to have surgery on this, and he basically blew that off. I think that you can question where this guy is at in terms of his commitment to football. For me, I'm going to have to see it from Michael Thomas. I was not drafting him last year. He was certainly going higher than he is now. I still think in like the 7th or 8th round, some other guys that are going in that range have a lot more upside. I don't have the ADPs in front of me off the top of my head, but like I'd much rather have Cortland Sutton if he's going in that range. I'd much rather have who are some of the, do you have ADPs up? Who are some wide receivers that are going in that range?
So guys that are right ahead of him, Drake London, Hunter Renfrow, after him, Alan Lazard, Brandon Ayuk, and Kadarius Toney.
Yeah, it's a little more bleak than I thought. I was way off on that Cortland Sutton ADP. The problem that you're going to have with Michael Thomas, and this gets into a little bit of game theory and redraft, is if Michael Thomas gets off to a really slow start, I think people are going to hold on to him on their bench because he's Michael Thomas. And it's like, well, I got to give this guy a chance. I can't drop Michael Thomas. And if you draft Michael Thomas in that range, obviously you can't do this on Underdog, but if in your redraft, but you drop Michael Thomas in that range, if we're 3 to 4 weeks in and you're not seeing anything, you're going to have to cut bait. I mean, you cannot afford to burn a roster spot, I think, especially early on the season when we see some of those hot waiver wire pickups on a guy that's just not producing. And I think that we have questions about in terms of his longevity. So I have concerns about Michael Thomas.
So actually one guy that's right ahead of Drake London is DeAndre Hopkins. And it's an interesting comparison because we know Hopkins is going to miss 6 weeks and then he'll be healthy. I mean, Michael Thomas's situation could be worse than that. It could be 6 terrible weeks that become 10 terrible weeks. I think that Hopkins is kind of on his way down a little bit, just looking at like his targets per out run and all that. But I would probably rather take a guy that I know is going to be out 6 weeks than Michael Thomas at this point.
And you know that Arizona offense should be a little bit better should be a lot better in terms of the passing volume and fantasy production.
Agreed.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the Saints have concerns about where Michael Thomas is at. They added Jarvis Landry this offseason. They used a first-round pick on Chris Olave. I think they're setting themselves up that if Michael Thomas isn't ready or they can't count on him to kind of phase him out.
Yeah, the Olave pick is very interesting because his draft label is pro ready. He's not like freak athlete who profile. He's not Jameson Williams. He is like a crisp route runner that's ready to produce on day one. It kind of seems like they're already 1 foot out the door. And actually, he's going. His ADP, Chris Olave is going off board at pick number 96, and Thomas is at 80. I would totally wait around and take Chris Olave.
100%.
But speaking of waiting around, we have Kadarius Toney, wide receiver of the New York Giants, coming off the board at 86.8 overall, wide receiver 42. So his injury history, this is 2021, rookie year 2021.
Yeah, what didn't he have?
Yeah, so a hamstring strain, pedal ankle sprain, quad/leg strain, abdomen muscle strain, shoulder. And that's from August through December. Now, what he showed on the field was receivers with a minimum of 50 targets. He had the 5th highest targets per route run in the NFL. So he looks like, to me, like I'm all in on Kadarius Toney just because his profile is like fantasy wide receiver 1, but he had so many soft tissue injuries. And one more thing before I turn the mic over to you. I was listening to a stream that noted high stakes player Crack Rock, CRAKROK, was doing the other day. And he's kind of plugged into the New York Giants organization. He was talking about whispers that he had heard from the Giants. And I guess Joe Judge Kadarius Toney wouldn't show up to practice, and Joe Judge would call him up, get in here, you need to be rehabbing, all that kind of stuff. And Toney basically would tell him, I'm the best player on the team. I don't have to practice, F off. And ownership canned Judge. And they brought in a new coaching. They said we do think we have a superstar. Obviously Saquon Barkley's not being used properly, et cetera, et cetera. And they've gone full reset on the organization. So I'm optimistic from a potential usage standpoint, but so many soft tissue injuries in his first year in the NFL. What do you think? Does he just need to stretch every day and take it seriously? And can he be okay? Or do we have some red flags?
Yeah, I mean, anytime a guy's banged up that much, I think it certainly raises his eyebrow. In terms of what he had to miss games for, I've got an inversion ankle sprain, pretty common. The thigh hamstring thing, where I have it is, and it might be a difference in where we're getting our data and the things I'm looking at. I have a quadriceps contusion, which isn't exactly it's technically a soft tissue injury, but it's like, it sounds like a really bad bruise or something like a Charlie horse. An oblique core injury, that's more soft tissue. And then shoulder injury. I mean, to me, if I look at this injury history, without knowing the player, I'm thinking this guy got knocked around a lot. This guy probably needs to put on some good muscle, bulk up a little bit, and this guy might need to. I hate saying this because I don't play in the league, but this might be a guy that needs to toughen up a little bit and play through a couple injuries, because I think everyone's kind of banged up in the NFL, and that might speak to a little bit of, I'm not that plugged into the New York Giants, but like you were talking about, is this guy taking football seriously and where he's at? I think as a Giants fan, it might give you a little PTSD because Kenny Golladay, I think, is taking a little bit of a similar path in terms of his mysterious injuries kind of adding up in terms of what's going on. But based on this alone and on the upside that you were talking about, I think Toney's worth taking a shot at and seeing what he can do in 2022.
Yeah. He's slender, right? He's 6 foot 193. His physical profile, what is it? Kent Platt, the guy who does Math Bomb, and the relative athletic score stuff. I mean, Toney is like a more athletic Stephon Diggs, but that's the frame. Is there are two very similar players. That doesn't make any sense to me, because when I'm watching Toney, he looks like an albatross out there, but yeah, he's pretty slim, and I think hopefully he takes your advice and packs on some muscle.
And it might be a learning curve thing too. In college, he was kind of used in that hybrid Percy Harvin type, LaVisca Chenault type role, where he wasn't necessarily a true wide receiver. And now we saw him on the NFL. Giants made him a wide receiver. So it could be a learning curve, learning the position, learning the in and outs of being a pro, and seeing where he's at next year.
Yeah. Yep. That checks out. And I mean, what the source that I'm getting all the injury info is draftsharks.com. They have a medical database you can subscribe to.
Yeah.
The point you're making about him missing time with certain injuries, it reminds me of when I spoke with Edwin last year on a podcast, he mentioned that he couldn't give like a source or anything, but he mentioned that he had spoken with a trainer on some staff, and they said, yeah, sometimes if a guy just like needs a day off, or maybe in this case doesn't show up, they'll just kind of put him on the practice report as like, hamstring strain on Wednesday, but he's fine Thursday and Friday. Maybe one or two of these where he didn't miss time, even though he's on the injury report, could be chalk up to that. Obviously, I'm totally speculating. But
and for Toney to miss time with those, I think it is a true injury. When I look at that questionable and probable data, so because that's something else that I look into, and it will come out very close to redraft season on 4 is just looking at specific injuries for specific position players. Some common ones: hamstring, inversion ankle sprain, high ankle sprain, AC joint sprain, those type of injuries. What do the numbers say? How much time on average do these guys miss? If they're questionable heading into the weekend, they do play. What's their fantasy production versus their healthy fantasy production? How they look 3 games out from an injury if they miss time? Just giving you some people some hard data in terms of what they can expect, for setting a redraft league. If a guy's coming off an injury, is this somebody that you want to play the first week coming off that injury? If you're playing in, DraftKings and you're setting up a daily fantasy lineup, do you want to pay that amount of salary or whatnot for somebody? Something to look into. I mean, Kadarius Toney missed time. So I think those were true injuries as opposed to somebody just needing a rest day. When you look at the questionable data and doubtful data as well, I mean, he's popping up with all those same injuries.
Cool. I'm excited to see that. That is that work, the statistics, the probabilities and everything of the week, the first guy, the week returns, all that first week the guy returns. I love that stuff. That's fun. I've had sure, and it's a curiosity of mine because I've broken like 20 bones, and so I enjoy I have a morbid fascination with injuries. So I absolutely love this stuff. Awesome. All right, round 9, Robert Woods. So I'm looking at Woods' injury list. I'm not going to read them all because there's only one we're here to talk about. The guy's been in the NFL since 2013, so he's racked up, like one per year, which is not, I don't think, all that concerning. Maybe it is. You'll tell me. But he suffered an ACL tear in November of 2021. It's a bit of a late in-season tear. My understanding is injury rates don't really differ 9 to 12 months post-operation. I don't know when he had his operation. What is your expectation for Woods? Will he be ready for week 1? When do we think he might be 100%, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. And this will give, people that are listening to this will get a little bit of an inside track, because this is the most recent piece I'm working on for 4for4, is just looking at some of the, high profile wide receivers heading into 2022 that are coming off ACL tears, because we got quite a few in terms of Chris Godwin, Michael Gallup, Robert Woods falls in that list. Jameson Williams, coming out of college, is coming off an ACL tear. So we've got what feels like a lot of high profile wide receivers this year coming off ACL tears. I'll say this. I think where Robert Woods had his injury, he's kind of at that threshold, but certainly I think he's going to be outside that 9 to 12 month period. It's hard to project, but if you made me, if you put a water gun to my head and said, tell me, is he going to play week 1 or not? I would say yes, based on just the data and when he had his injury. For whatever reason, the demands of the position, maybe some of the, athletic abilities, wide receivers tend to bounce back from ACL tears a little bit better than running backs in terms of their production. So compared to the year prior, there's about a 5% decrease in targets per game, a 3% decrease in receptions per game. Yards per game stays about the same. Yards per reception stays about the same. So, I mean, those are small percentages in terms of what they knock off pre-injury versus post-injury. I think Robert Woods is in a decent spot. He's a really good player. We saw him thrive in that Rams offense. It's going to be a little bit different. This is going to certainly be more of a run-heavy offense in Tennessee. But he's a pro. He's a good player. And everything I've seen from him early on says, he should be ready, and you can see what you get from him early on in the season.
Yeah, those are pretty tiny drop. You would say 5% or 3% in receptions and like 5% targets. I mean, it's a different team and everything. Nothing. Yeah, that's pretty much negligible. And this is a dude who, was a steady wide receiver too for like 3 years leading up to this. So, okay, cool. Yeah, I have been inclined to just draft him instead of Treylon Burks. We don't have time to get into Burks too, but yeah, I'm okay. This is cool. He seems like a pretty solid round 9 pick here. Round 10, you mentioned him earlier on, and he's like right at the end of the 10th round, maybe one pick into the 11th. But Kenny Golladay, wide receiver, New York Giants. For schematic reasons, I'm a little bit lower on him than I am on Toney. But to cover the injury info, thigh, hamstring, sprain, pull in August. In September, inguinal hip strain, knee strain, chest/rib sprain in December. And he had a big hip issue. It was another inguinal hip thing in 2020. Is he just saying that his hips bugging him? What's going on? I mean, we saw like the funny photos of him out on like date night and everything where he's behaving like he's not injured. What is the deal with Kenny Golladay?
Yeah, this is tough. My friend at 4for4, Brandon Niles, wrote about Kenny Golladay and kind of what to expect. And he asked me for a little bit of an injury blurb, and I'll just read it here. It's super short and concise in terms of what we've been looking at. So after a delayed start to the 2020 season due to a hamstring injury, Kenny Golladay eventually missed the second half of the year with a mystery hip injury, like we were talking about, which left many questioning his commitment to football and the reliability for the future. In the beginning of 2021, he was on the right trajectory, but hyperextended his knee in week 5, missing 3 consecutive games, and finished the rest of the season as a wide receiver 29 on a points per game basis. He then in the offseason had a cleanup procedure, arthroscopic procedure on his knee, which could explain his subpar fantasy production. I think this is a guy that just probably, for whatever reason, gets nicked up and does not play very good when he's nicked up for whatever reason. I mean, I think the fantasy community definitely misses Galladay as a fantasy asset. I think if you're just a football fan, you probably miss Kenny Golladay. We're used to so many of those big plays where he'd go up and just moss defenders and jump over them, kind of a lesser scale of Calvin Johnson in Detroit, which is why he got that name kind of Babytron early on in his career. I don't know. I think he's one of those players that in fantasy drafts, I don't think I'm necessarily looking for him, but at the right spot, 10th, 11th round, I might take a flyer on him. In best ball, it's a little bit tougher, but again, your traditional redraft leagues, he'd be somebody it's like, all right, you're on my bench. Let me see what you do the first 2 weeks of the season. If I see nothing, I'm picking up the hot name off the waiver wire, and I'm not even like flinching. I'm not even going to think about it. Like, let's see what you can give us, and then if not, move on.
Is there anything inherently like recurring with the inguinal hip strains?
The problem is I don't. This one is like super muddy, and
yeah,
I'm pretty. I talk to a lot of different injury analysts in fantasy football in terms of like going down some rabbit holes and finding out injuries. I got a big question mark in my Excel sheet here when looking at Kenny Golladay in terms of the hip injury. I literally have hip injury question mark. I don't know. I don't know what was going on. I don't know if it was a real thing. So it's hard to really make any judgments off of that.
Okay. All right. Do you have time to cover our honorable mention guy that we had in the notes?
Awesome, man. Yeah, man.
Cool.
Let's do it.
All right. So JK Dobbins, we were all excited to draft him last year, at least as a dynamic rusher, if not a pass catcher out of the Ravens backfield. And then he tears his ACL in August of 2021. And it seems as though this might not have been an isolated ACL tear, and he might start the season on the physically unable to perform list. Do I have that right?
Yeah. I mean, he injured, I think his MCL and possibly meniscus in addition to that. I should know that consistently off the top of my head, but I can't remember exactly. But it was a multi-ligament knee injury. So we talked about some of that wide receiver data in terms of, versus the pre-injury. For running backs, it's a little bit more dramatic. I think versus career averages, they see about a 9% decrease in carries per game, 10% decrease in rush yards per game, 2% decrease in rush yards per attempt. So they're still somewhat efficient. I think that's a pretty negligible decline. But there's certainly some efficiency metrics and some volume concerns that I think could be because of the efficiency or could be because teams are managing their workload coming off that ACL tear. I think there's reasons to be concerned.
It was the LCL. Sorry to interrupt you there.
Yeah, no problem. It still falls in the same boat. All those LCL, MCL, Ls, the ligaments. I mean, it's a multi-ligament knee injury that I think just delays your recovery a little bit in terms of what you can do immediately after surgery. So that's why it can hurt you sometimes in terms of your recovery. I think it adds a couple of weeks. I don't think it's the end all be all, but sometimes can delay it. For me, for JK Dobbins, it comes down to this. If you're a running back that's coming off an ACL tear, to me, you have to do both. You have to be the receiver and the running back. We talked about with like Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley kind of falls into that in terms of those all-purpose plus backs that do a lot. I don't think JK Dobbins has that. There's questions about it coming out of college. I think in Baltimore, it's just not going to happen with Lamar Jackson there. So he's already got that going against him. And then when you talk about, the rushing metrics that go down the year after an ACL tear, Dobbins is one of those running backs that's kind of in that dead zone. Like, I'm going to take Etienne over him. I'm going to take Cam Akers over him. I think you're splitting hairs maybe with Zeke and him, but I've seen Zeke do it, and I think Dallas has got a really exciting offense. I'd probably take Zeke over him. Like, I'm just not super high on JK Dobbins, at least in 2022.
Yeah, it's interesting to phrase it like this because he's so young, right? I mean, he's a young man. He's 25 and a half. Yeah, he's in his age 23 season, not 25 and a half, 23.5. But as you say, he kind of just profiles as a grinder back. I mean, he is an agile one, but this type of back, as you have the data shows, his decline might come at age 24, and he's now 23 coming off a multi-ligament injury. I mean, I have trouble wanting to draft him in redraft and in dynasty.
Yeah. I think when you look at someone like a JK Dobbins, his ceiling is probably like a Nick Chubb.
Okay.
But if you look at that's not a bad thing. I mean, it's certainly cap. We know Nick Chubb has a ceiling because of his lack of involvement in the running game. But what makes Nick Chubb really great is he is a great rusher. Film grinders will say he's probably the best pure running back in the game in terms of like finding holes and doing things. And I think J.K. Dobbins can kind of have that similar path. But the year after the ACL tear, to be that guy, I think is asking a lot. I have enough question marks that early enough in drafts, that 4th, 5th round. There's a lot of running backs in that zone that I would rather, take a chance on. So I think if you have him in dynasty, or if you're interested in trying to acquire him in dynasty, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think especially in the Ravens run heavy offense, maybe 2 years from now when they can turn to JK Dobbins and be like, all right, you're fully healthy. We're going to feed you the rock. Like, you're going to be the guy. I think from a volume perspective, he could be really interesting in fantasy. But if they're not going to do that, he's going to be slightly less efficient and the passing game is non-existent. You're probably left with an RB that's flirting around RB 17 to 25. And it's just kind of like,
yeah,
I want to take bigger swings in those early rounds.
I do too. And the whole Ravens group seems to be going in the 50s here. You got Lamar at 51, who I'd be fine with, especially if I grabbed Mark Andrews early. Bateman's at 54. Brandon Cooks at 52. I will take Brandon Cooks over him. Maybe Juju, depending on the draft. And I am so high on Kyler Murray, and Kyler Murray's going one spot behind JK Dobbins. I'll basically have to force myself to take Dobbins just to like get that exposure instead of drafting Kyler, because I'm 9 times out of 10 I want to go Kyler there. Anyway, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, I mean, I think that's a similar thought process that I have.
Yeah. Okay. All right, Adam, this was fantastic. Please tell everybody where they can find you.
Yeah. Appreciate you having me on the show. This is, I'm always happy to do this. People can find me on Twitter at @therealadam_H. You can find my work at 4for4.com, 4for4 fantasy football. You can follow them on Twitter. Gonna have some things coming out as we get closer to redraft season. I've got some injury profiles already on the website. I've got another one that's going to be coming soon. We got Christian McCaffrey, JK Dobbins, Travis Etienne, and we talk about some of those wide receivers coming off ACL tears, talk about some of the injury things, and then during the season have a weekly article that basically breaks down the injuries and what their fantasy implications are for that weekend for the rest of the season.
Okay. Awesome stuff. Everybody go check that out. I hope to get you on again before the season starts, but definitely in season if that's not the case.
Anytime.
Cool. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Talk to you soon.